Section 21 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel, Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place Names the Place, Part 2. To prevent the choking fits which the journey might otherwise give me, the doctor had advised me to take, as we started, a good stiff dose of beer or brandy, so as to begin the journey in a state of what he called euphoria, in which the nervous system is for a time less vulnerable. I had not yet made up my mind whether I should do this, but I wished at least that my grandmother should admit that if I did so decide, I should have wisdom and authority on my side. I spoke therefore as if my hesitation were concerned only with where I should go for my drink, to the bar on the platform or to the restaurant car on the train. But immediately, at the air of reproach which my grandmother's face assumed, an air of not wishing even to entertain such an idea for a moment. "What?" I said to myself, suddenly determining upon this action of going out to drink, the performance of which became necessary as a proof of my independence, since the verbal announcement of it had not succeeded in passing unchallenged. "What? You know how ill I am. You know what the doctor ordered, and you treat me like this." When I had explained to my grandmother how unwell I felt, her distress, her kindness were so apparent as she replied, "Run along then, quickly. Get yourself some beer or a liqueur if it will do you any good," that I flung myself upon her, almost smothering her in kisses. And if after that I went and drank a great deal too much in the restaurant car of the train, that was because I felt that otherwise I should have a more violent attack than usual, which was just what would vex her most. When at the first stop I clambered back into our compartment, I told my grandmother how pleased I was to be going to Baalbek, that I felt that everything would go off splendidly, that after all I should soon grow used to being without mamma, that the train was most comfortable, the steward and attendants in the bar so friendly that I should like to make the journey often so as to have opportunities of seeing them again. My grandmother, however, did not appear to feel the same joy as myself at all these good tidings. She answered, without looking me in the face, "Why don't you try to get a little sleep?" and turned her gaze to the window, the blind of which, though we had drawn it, did not completely cover the glass, so that the sun could and did slip in over the polished oak of the door and the cloth of the seat, like an advertisement of a life shared with nature far more persuasive than those posted higher upon the walls of the compartment, by the railway company, representing places in the country, the names of which I could not make out from where I sat. The same warm and slumberous light which lies along a forest glade. But when my grandmother thought that my eyes were shut, I could see her, now and again, from among the large black spots on her veil, steal a glance at me, then withdraw it, and steal back again, like a person trying to make himself, so as to get into the habit, perform some exercise that hurts him. Thereupon I spoke to her, but that seemed not to please her either. And yet to myself the sound of my own voice was pleasant, as were the most imperceptible, the most internal movements of my body. And so I endeavored to prolong it. I allowed each of my inflections to hang lazily upon its word. I felt each glance from my eyes arrive just at the spot to which it was directed, and stay there beyond the normal period. Now, sit still and rest," said my grandmother. "If you can't manage to sleep, read something." And she handed me a volume of Madame de Sévigné, which I opened, while she buried herself in the Memoirs de Madame de Beausergent. She never traveled anywhere without a volume of each. They were her two favorite authors. With no conscious movement of my head, feeling a keen pleasure in maintaining a posture after I had adopted it, I lay back, holding in my hands the volume of Madame de Sévigné, which I had allowed to close, without lowering my eyes to it, or indeed letting them see anything but the blue window blind. But the contemplation of this blind appeared to be an admirable thing, and I should not have troubled to answer anyone who might have sought to distract me from contemplating it. The blue color of this blind seemed to me, not perhaps by its beauty, but by its intense vivacity, to efface so completely all the colors that had passed before my eyes from the day of my birth up to the moment in which I had gulped down the last of my drink, and it had begun to take effect, that when compared with this blue, they were as drab, as void as must be retrospectively the darkness in which he has lived to a man born blind, whom a subsequent operation has at length enabled to see and to distinguish colors. An old ticket collector came to ask for our tickets. The silvery gleam that shone from the metal buttons of his jacket charmed me in spite of my absorption. I wanted to ask him to sit down beside us, but he passed on to the next carriage, and I thought with longing of the life led by railway men, for whom, since they spent all their time on the line, hardly a day could pass without their seeing this odd collector. The pleasure that I found in staring at the blind, and in feeling that my mouth was half open, began at length to diminish. I became more mobile. I even moved in my seat. I opened the book that my grandmother had given me and turned its pages casually, reading whatever caught my eye. And as I read, I felt my admiration for Madame de Sévigné grow. It is a mistake to let oneself be taken in by the purely formal details, idioms of the period, or social conventions, the effect of which is that certain people believe that they have caught the Sévigné manner when they have said, "Tell me, my dear," or "That Count struck me as being a man of parts," or "Haymaking is the sweetest thing in the world." Madame de Sévigné imagines already that she is being like her grandmother because she can write, "Monsieur de la Bouille is bearing wonderfully, sir, and is in excellent condition to hear the news of his death," or "Oh, my dear Marquis, how your letter enchanted me. What can I do but answer it?" Or, "Meseems, sir, that you owe me a letter, and I owe you some boxes of bergamot. I discharge my debts to the number of 8. Others shall follow. Never has the soil borne so many. Apparently for your gratification." And she writes in this style also her letter on bleeding, on lemons, and so forth, supposing it to be typical of the letters of Madame de Sévigné. But my grandmother, who had approached that lady from within, attracted to her by her own love of kinsfolk and of nature, had taught me to enjoy the real beauties of her correspondence, which are altogether different. They were presently to strike me all the more forcibly inasmuch as Madame de Sévigné is a great artist of the same school as a painter whom I was to meet at Balbec, where his influence on my way of seeing things was immense. I realized at Balbec that it was in the same way as he that she presented things to her readers, in the order of our perception of them, instead of first having to explain them in relation to their several causes. But already that afternoon in the railway carriage, as I read over again that letter in which the moonlight comes, I cannot resist the temptation. I put on all my bonnets and veils, though there is no need of them. I walk along this mall where the air is as sweet as in my chamber. I find 1,000 phantasms, monks white and black, sisters gray and white, linen cast here and there on the ground, men enshrouded upright against the tree trunks. I was enraptured by what, a little later, I should have described, for does she not draw landscapes in the same way as he draws characters? As the Dostoevsky side of Madame de Sévigné's letters. When, that evening, after having accompanied my grandmother to her destination and spent some hours in her friend's house, I had returned by myself to the train, at any rate I found nothing to distress me in the night which followed. This was because I had not to spend it in a room of the somnolence of which would have kept me awake. I was surrounded by the soothing activity of all those movements of the train which kept me company, offered to stay and converse with me if I could not sleep, lulled me with their sounds which I wedded, as I had often wedded the chime of the Cambrai bells, now to one rhythm, now to another, hearing as the whim took me first 4 level and equivalent semiquavers, then 1 semiquaver furiously dashing against a crochet. They neutralized the centrifugal force of my insomnia by exercising upon it a contrary pressure which kept me in equilibrium, and on which my immobility and presently my drowsiness felt themselves to be borne with the same sense of refreshment that I should have had I been resting under the protecting vigilance of powerful forces, on the breast of nature and of life, had I been able for a moment to incarnate myself in a fish that sleeps in the sea, driven unheeding by the currents and the tides, or in an eagle outstretched upon the air with no support but the storm. Sunrise is a necessary concomitant of long railway journeys, just as are hard-boiled eggs, illustrated papers, packs of cards, rivers upon which boats strain but make no progress. At a certain moment, when I was counting over the thoughts that had filled my mind in the preceding minutes so as to discover whether I had just been asleep or not, and when the very uncertainty which made me ask myself the question was to furnish me with an affirmative answer, in the pale square of the window, over a small black wood, I saw some ragged clouds whose fleecy edges were of a fixed dead pink, not liable to change, like the color that dyes the wing which has grown to wear it, or the sketch upon which the artist's fancy has washed it. But I felt that, unlike them, this color was due neither to inertia nor to caprice, but to necessity and life. Presently there gathered behind it reserves of light. It brightened, the sky turned to a crimson which I strove, gluing my eyes to the window, to see more clearly, for I felt that it was related somehow to the most intimate life of nature. But the course of the line altering, the train turned, the morning scene gave place in the frame of the window to a nocturnal village, its roofs still blue with moonlight, its pond encrusted with the opalescent nacre of night, beneath a firmament still powdered with all its stars. And I was lamenting the loss of my strip of pink sky, when I caught sight of it afresh, but red this time, in the opposite window which it left at a second bend in the line, so that I spent my time running from one window to the other to reassemble, to collect on a single canvas, the intermittent, antipodean fragments of my fine, scarlet, ever-changing morning, and to obtain a comprehensive view of it and a continuous picture. The scenery became broken. Abrupt, the train stopped at a little station between two mountains. Far down the gorge, on the edge of a hurrying stream, one could see only a solitary watch-house, deep planted in the water which ran past on a level with its windows. If a person can be the product of a soil the peculiar charm of which one distinguishes in that person, more even than the peasant girl whom I had so desperately longed to see appear, when I wandered by myself along the Méséglise way in the woods of Ruchionville, such a person must be the big girl whom I now saw emerge from the house, and climbing a path lighted by the first slanting rays of the sun, come towards the station carrying a jar of milk. In her valley, from which its congregated limits hid the rest of the world, she could never see anyone save in these trains which stopped for a moment only. She passed down the line of windows, offering coffee and milk to a few awakened passengers. Purpled with the glow of morning, her face was rosier than the sky. I felt in her presence that desire to live which is reborn in us whenever we become conscious anew of beauty and of happiness. We invariably forget that these are individual qualities, and substituting for them in our mind a conventional type at which we arrive by striking a sort of mean amongst the different faces that have taken our fancy, the pleasures we have known, we are left with mere abstract images which are lifeless and dull because they are lacking in precisely that element of novelty, different from anything we have known, that element which is proper to beauty and to happiness. And we deliver on life a pessimistic judgment which we suppose to be fair, for we believed that we were taking into account when we formed it happiness and beauty, whereas in fact we left them out and replaced them by syntheses in which there is not a single atom of either. So it is that a well-read man will at once begin to yawn with boredom when anyone speaks to him of a new good book, because he imagines a sort of composite of all the good books that he has read and knows already, whereas a good book is something special, something incalculable, and is made up not of the sum of all previous masterpieces, but of something which the most thorough assimilation of every one of them would not enable him to discover, since it exists not in their sum, but beyond it. Once he has become acquainted with this new work, the well-read man, till then apathetic, feels his interest awaken in the reality which it depicts. So, alien to the models of beauty which my fancy was wont to sketch when I was by myself, this strapping girl gave me at once the sensation of a certain happiness. The sole form, always different, in which we may learn the sensation of happiness. Of a happiness that would be realized by my staying and living there by her side. But in this again the temporary cessation of habit played a great part. I was giving the milk girl the benefit of what was really my own entire being, ready to taste the keenest joys, which now confronted her. As a rule, it is with our being reduced to a minimum that we live. Most of our faculties lie dormant because they can rely upon habit, which knows what there is to be done and has no need of their services. But on this morning of travel, the interruption of the routine of my existence, the change of place and time, had made their presence indispensable. My habits, which were sedentary and not matutinal, played me false, and all my faculties came hurrying to take their place, vying with one another in their zeal, rising each of them like waves in a storm, to the same unaccustomed level, from the basest to the most exalted, from breath, appetite, the circulation of my blood, to receptivity and imagination. I cannot say whether, so as to make me believe that this girl was unlike the rest of women, the rugged charm of these barren tracts had been added to her own, but if so, she gave it back to them. Life would have seemed an exquisite thing to me if only I had been free to spend it, hour after hour, with her, to go with her to the stream, to the cow, to the train, to be always at her side, to feel that I was known to her, had my place in her thoughts. She would have initiated me into the delights of country life and of the first hours of the day. I signaled to her to give me some of her coffee. I felt that I must be noticed by her. She did not see me. I called to her. Above her body, which was of massive build, the complexion of her face was so burnished and so ruddy that she appeared almost as though I were looking at her through a lighted window. She had turned and was coming towards me. I could not take my eyes from her face, which grew larger as she approached, like a sun which it was somehow possible to arrest in its course and draw towards one, letting itself be seen at close quarters, blinding the eyes with its blaze of red and gold. She fastened on me her penetrating stare, but while the porters ran along the platform shutting doors, the train had begun to move. I saw her leave the station and go down the hill to her home. It was broad daylight now. I was speeding away from the dawn. Whether my exultation had been produced by this girl, or had, on the other hand, been responsible for most of the pleasure that I had found in the sight of her, in the sense of her presence, in either event she was so closely associated with it that my desire to see her again was really not so much a physical as a mental desire, not to allow this state of enthusiasm to perish utterly, not to be separated forever from the person who, although quite unconsciously, had participated in it. It was not only because this state was a pleasant one. It was principally because, just as increased tension upon a chord of accelerated vibration of a nerve produces a different sound or color, it gave another tonality to all that I saw, introduced me as an actor upon the stage of an unknown and infinitely more interesting universe. That handsome girl, whom I still could see, while the train gathered speed, was like part of a life other than the life that I knew, separated from it by a clear boundary in which the sensations that things produced in me were no longer the same, from which to return now to my old life would be almost suicide. To procure myself the pleasure of feeling that I had at least an attachment to this new life, it would suffice that I should live near enough to the little station to be able to come to it every morning for a cup of coffee from the girl. But alas, she must be forever absent from the other life towards which I was being borne with ever-increasing swiftness, a life to the prospect of which I resigned myself only by weaving plans that would enable me to take the same train again some day, and to stop at the same station. A project which would have the further advantage of providing with subject matter the selfish, active, practical, mechanical, indolent, centrifugal tendency which is that of the human mind. For our mind turns readily aside from the effort which it is required if it is to analyze in itself, in a general and disinterested manner, a pleasant impression which we have received. And as, on the other hand, we wish to continue to think of that impression, the mind prefers to imagine it in the future tense, which, while it gives us no clue as to the real nature of the thing, saves us the trouble of recreating it in our own consciousness, and allows us to hope that we may receive it afresh from without. End of section 21.